to the lecture Writing Goals and Objectives for Occupational Therapy 236 OT with Youth. My name is Melissa Kay and I'm your instructor. Let's go ahead and get started. This lecture is about writing goals and objectives and some things to remember and focus on and emphasize and other things that you want to stay away from. So it's a very hands-on kind of lecture, and we'll be practicing in class. To start with, I want to bring your attention to the assessment to intervention flow so that you can see where the goal writing process takes place. If you look to the left of your screen, you have your initial assessment, and you identify areas of difficulty, the client's personal goals and interests, an understanding of barriers, which comes from you as informed by your client and perhaps their team and their caregivers, and then the goals get written, and finally an intervention plan gets created. So the goals happen between the initial assessment and the initiation of intervention. Okay, so the purposes of goal writing. Definitely to define and clarify what the client is expected to accomplish. We also use goals to measure change, to monitor progress, and to provide a record of therapeutic gains so that, especially, if we're looking at interfacing with an institution, a school, a hospital, etc., we have an idea of what they did and how they did it and how that worked. All right, enough said. Occupational therapy goals have some common features regardless of what population you're writing for. They are client-centered. They are functional, so they're actually based on skills that we want the client to demonstrate. They're focused on engagement in occupation, so we would likely not write a goal about, say, therapeutic exercise or participating in physical agent modalities, things like that. Intervention plans should include both goals, also known as long-term goals or LTGs, and objectives, which are short-term goals or STG. And at the end of this lecture, we'll talk about the differences. There's some traits of well-written goals, and we went over this a little bit in our lecture about school-based practice. We're going to revisit now. Some of you have been taught under the RUMBA acronym, and others of you under the SMART acronym. Either one is perfectly fine. Now, a lot of students kind of want to rip their hair out because they just want one set way of writing goals. What I can say is there's not just one way of writing goals, because when you go out into practice, you're going to be practicing in different environments, different contexts for different companies, and they will all have their particular way of presenting the goals. In school, there's also different instructors, and we have our different perspectives pretty much based on both how we were taught and also what area of practice we specialize in. So as kind of frustrating as it may be initially, to get used to the factors that are present in all goals and then to tweak it a little bit to fit the needs of the assignment or the environment, class, workplace, etc., is probably your best bet. The other thing I want to say about well-written goals is that it is a hard skill to develop. So if you're not able to just sit down and boom, pop them out, you are not alone. I could not write goals very well for when I was an entry-level therapist, and then it came slowly over time, and I had a lot of examples to help me out. So give yourself a break. Give yourself some flexibility of thought and mental capacity, and let's proceed into this process. When we think about writing goals, we want to think about a performance, right? So in this case, our performance is Josiah. That's the client, and we always want to include the client's names. will improve his note-taking skills. So our occupational performance goal is improvement in note-taking skills. The second step is to identify the deficits that are preventing this achievement. So, to improve his note-taking skills, Josiah will improve his fine motor precision on writing tasks. Now, we could look at this in a bunch of different ways. When we do an evaluation, what we're going to be doing is pinpointing what's up with note-taking. Why can't Josiah do it, right? And in this case, we've figured out that he has difficulty with fine motor precision. We could have found out in the evaluation that he had difficulty with attention, or difficulty with spatial awareness, or difficulty with caring about writing goals, right? So his motivation. But no, in this case, it's fine motor. So within our goal, we want the occupational performance. We also want to focus that on identifying the deficits that are preventing achievement, because those are the things we're going to work on. Make sense? All right. Then the last step is the measurement method and timeline. So then we have this goal to demonstrate improved note-taking skills. That's our end goal, our occupational performance. Josiah will increase his fine motor precision. That is addressing the deficit that we've identified in the evaluation. And then the final part is, as evidenced by independent completion of a 5-word sentence on wide-ruled paper with 80% accuracy of letter formation in 3 of 4 trials, as reported by the classroom teacher in April 2020. Okay, so that is a mouthful. Let's unpack it a little bit, okay? If we don't know how much he needs to write, we're not going to be able to measure it. So we include 5-word sentence. When we think about, well, how is this writing going to be accomplished? We want to be sure that the tools and equipment that he's going to use are appropriate for his skill level and also what he needs to do. So wide-ruled paper. Okay. Then 80% accuracy of letter formation in 3 of 4 trials. So that means that almost all the time, 75% of the time, right? So 3 out of 4 days, he has to do this. And then when he's actually doing it, he needs to be accurate 80% of the time. So a pretty high level of the time. For my way of thinking, if we have like a 50% accuracy, we should come up with a different goal, because at 50%, it could be chance, right? So we want 80, 90, 95% accuracy, maybe 75. And we want more than half the time as well. Finally, we're saying as reported by the classroom teacher, and we're giving a date, April 2020. The reporting person is important when we're considering school-based practice. If we were considering clinic-based practice, we may not have to put that in there because we know that it's an OT, right? Alternately, we might want to put it in there because we might want to ensure that Josiah is doing this across environments. He's not just doing it in therapy, he's doing it in the real world. And finally, this is not something that absolutely needs to go in a goal, but I have gotten in the habit of doing it, and that is to provide a baseline. And the baseline says, this is where the student or youth is functioning right now. So Josiah's baseline is at 50% accuracy in letter formation, and we want to raise that by 30%. Here's a final look at that with all 3 of the aspects of the goal writing included. So we have his performance, we have an identification of what's preventing achievement, and we're addressing that in particular in our goals and therefore in our intervention plan. And then we make it measurable and we add a timeline. Now, the timeline is April 2020. We don't know when he started, right? So different goals will have different amounts of timeline to be met, and different goals will have different timelines based on the institution that you're working for. So some places goals are much longer, up to a year. Other places they're more like 3 months. Okay. The components of goals and objectives. So now we're going to break things down. The first thing we want to consider is something called the terminal behavior. That is the performance that we want to see, right? So I called it occupational performance before. Now we're calling it terminal behavior in goal writing lingo. That's the only difference, yeah? Okay, so here are some examples of a terminal behavior. The client will don pants, will complete a 3-step meal prep, will feed themselves, or will attend to a puzzle activity. The terminal behavior is also sometimes called the outcome or the objective, and we want to be as specific as possible when we write about the terminal behavior. Here's a pro tip. We want to keep it measurable. What does that mean? We want to avoid using verbs that are difficult or even impossible to measure. So examples include the client will understand, appreciate, internalize, realize, or know. Contrast that with our previous slide, which is don pants. We can very easily see if our client has donned their pants, right? Their pants will be on as opposed to off. Complete a 3-step meal prep. We can tell, have they completed step 1, step 2, step 3? Same thing with feeding themselves. Same thing with a puzzle activity. When we get into verbs that are like understand, we can't very well reach into a client's mind to actually determine, do they understand? Do they appreciate or realize or know? So that's just a tip to help you keep your goals very measurable. The next step after identifying what it is that we want the client to do is to identify how are we going to measure whether or not the client has actually done the thing that we want them to do. There's different ways of doing this, and they must be compatible with the behavior that we want to see, with the terminal behavior, with the occupational performance, etc. So one way we could do it would be to say an amount of time. In this case, the first bullet point says independently for 30 seconds in 3 or 4 trials. So there's a bunch of things in there. What we're looking for is the all by yourself for 30 seconds, right? We're also looking at if we watch the client do this thing 4 times, they will successfully do it at least 3 of the 4 times. Another way that we could look at it would be how accurate are they in their performance? The second bullet point looks at 80% accuracy, and if we observe the client every single day or had somebody else observe them, they would do it 5 of 5 times, so 5 days out of the week, right? And the final way would be an amount of time as a limit, right? So the top one is they'll do it for 30 seconds. That's a longevity, right? The other way that we could look at it is how much time do they take, because it shouldn't take a long time. So we, again, apply these criteria to different types of behaviors. For example, if we wanted somebody to independently do something for 30 seconds in 3 or 4 trials, that could be appropriate to a hand washing goal. We want them to put soap on their hands and rub their hands together for 30 seconds, 3 or 4 times, right? So that would make sense that it's a longevity. You don't want to wash your hands for a half a second. With the 80% accuracy, we could look at it just like we looked at Josiah's goal in the preceding slides, and think about we want letter formation or letter size or position on the page to be 80% accurate, right? And in some cases, we would actually specify, what do we mean by accuracy? So that's a percentage of how right it is, right, or how masterful. And then the third way would be this within 10 seconds, right? So if we take our idea of a hand washing goal, we could say that the student or youth would initiate hand washing within 10 seconds of flushing the toilet, right? So maybe it's a goal that we want to streamline the toileting process for a teen who's in junior high or high school, right? So in that case, we would want kind of a narrow time frame. So the time frame can be a long, the longevity of the behavior, or it can be the shortness of the behavior. The next component of goals and objectives are the conditions. And I want you to note that not all goals and objectives need a condition. It's optional depending on what the behavior is, depending on what the criteria is, and depending on how much help or assistance the individual needs. So some examples of conditions are provided a dressing stick with a step-by-step written list, with a plate guard and built-up handled utensils. And then we have a level of assist, right, with min, mod, max assist, or supervision, or standby. And then we can also apply it to the environment, a quiet environment free of distractions. And as you can probably intuit, different behaviors are going to require different kinds of assist. So a dressing stick is going to be because somebody, can't reach all by themselves, right? They have some limitation in their flexibility and dexterity. Step-by-step written list might be for attention or memory issues. The plate garden built-up handled utensils would be a motor issue. Level of assist applies across the board. Sometimes we would also specify like with verbal prompting. So it can be a very wide range of actual person assist. And it can be the OT, but it could also be the classroom teacher, the caregiver, etc. And then finally, with our environmental condition example, provided a quiet environment free of distractions. So if we have, say, a high schooler who has ADHD, and our goal is to extend the amount of time that he will focus on his homework after school, we might want to say provided a quiet environment free of distractions. We could contrast that with having him be in, the cafeteria after school with his peers all around. See what I mean? So conditions are not necessary, but they a lot of times help us define what successful performance would be. The other thing about conditions is that sometimes they can go right at the front of the goal, and sometimes they go at the end of the goal. So for example, provided a dressing stick, Phoebe will don her shoes and socks 90% of the time independently. You could also say Phoebe will don her shoes and socks 90% of the time independently when provided a dressing stick. So it's a little bit of wordsmithing to figure out where it fits and where it fits best. Either place is appropriate. Then we have the time frame, which we looked at a little bit with Josiah, and it could be in 2 weeks, in 3 sessions, by a given date, within 1 year. It could be any time frame that is appropriate, not only to the meeting of the goal, but to how the place that that is facilitating your client being seen works goal writing. So, for example, in an acute hospital, goals get met within a few sessions. In school, we review goals quarterly, and we have an annual meeting to come up with new goals. So that's a very different time frame. In my private practice, we review goals twice a year and more frequently if necessary. So we always want to date our goals so that we can tell, well, what's in 2 weeks or what's 3 sessions from now. Do you know what I mean? All right, so time frame is important. Each long-term goal and short-term goal, aka objective, should have all the components. So this is kind of putting together all of the different parts and pieces. The client will don pants independently, provided a dressing stick, in 1 week. The client will complete a 3-step meal prep with supervision, provided a step-by-step written list by March 23rd, 2020. And you can read the rest of them, but notice that they have the client. Sometimes it can be the name of the client. They have the terminal behavior or the occupational performance listed. And they also have any condition like a step-by-step written list, built-up handled utensil, etc. And all of these have it. Again, you don't need it. And they have a time frame. Now, notice that they don't have this piece of the puzzle, which is identifying what is the problem that has precipitated writing this goal, right? So it's inherent sometimes. Like, for example, client will don pants independently, provided a dressing stick, in 1 week. The condition actually lets us know what the problem is. Okay, so the client donning their pants is independently is hindered because of something. But once we know that a dressing stick is needed, we know it has to be something that has to do with flexibility or dexterity or reach. So sometimes we just include it. And sometimes we have a condition that makes it evident, and you can go both ways. Now, again, I'll return to this idea that writing goals is a little maddening, right? And we don't always do it the same. It depends on the client, depends on the behavior, depends on the place that you're writing for. So we're going to explore this a lot more so that you're comfortable including everything that needs to be included in your goals. All right, so some examples. The client will be independent in using compensatory cognitive strategies, such as, so I'm defining that, so that he is able to successfully log on, read and respond to emails, and complete an internet search for 60 minutes within 4 weeks, as observed by the OTR. So we have the goal, which is logging on, reading and responding to emails, and doing an internet search. So that's a whole bunch of stuff, right? We could characterize it as computer use. The client will be independent in this, so that's a level of proficiency, and they'll have compensatory cognitive strategies, which might include a list of steps. It might include pictures of each part. It might include somebody prompting the client to move on to the next step. We don't know. So we'll want to specify that. And we have a time frame, which is 4 weeks. And who's going to be responsible? The OT will observe it. Now, in this goal, there's a little bit of a problem, and I want to draw your attention to that. The problem with this goal is, what if the client can log on and respond to emails, but they can't complete an internet search for 60 minutes? So when we're writing goals, it often behooves us to just write one behavior, right? So the client will successfully be able to log on to his email account. The client will successfully be able to read and respond to emails, goal 2. The client will complete a 60-minute internet search, goal 3. Now, we could, again, characterize this as the long-term goal is computer proficiency, right? So it's not technically wrong, but we need to be able to differentiate if they've met the goal or not and why. So in some cases, it may be necessary or desirable to break it down into smaller pieces. So just keep that in mind. All right. Our next goal, the patient will be independent in using a checklist during self-care sequence and will perform all critical steps. Taking medication, brushing teeth, eating breakfast, creating a to-do list for the day on at least 5 of 7 days a week within 8 weeks as reported by residential staff. So let's deconstruct this one a little bit. In this case, our person is the patient. Again, they'll be independent and they will be independent and using a checklist, right? So that is a condition. They will have a checklist during self-care. And again, they're going to perform all these steps. So the goal is independence in, say, morning self-care, right? Take your pills, brush your teeth, eat your breakfast, create a to-do list. And the way that we're measuring it is that they will do this at least 5 of 7 days, and they'll do it within 8 weeks. So that's the time frame to reach that goal. Now, again, we could break this goal down into smaller hunks if we wanted to or needed to, or we could characterize it as they will be proficient and independent in morning routine, right? Because that's what it's describing. So you have your choice. It would depend on how you wanted to phrase it, who was going to be responsible for that goal, and how much you really felt like it needed to get broken down into smaller steps based on the client's level and based on how much work was necessary to get there. We want to distinguish between long-term goals and short-term goals, which are also called objectives. The long-term goal is the expected outcome of therapy, and the time frame, of course, as I've said, is dependent on the setting. The short-term goal is the building blocks of the long-term goal. So those are the smaller steps that are necessary. So if we go back to our examples, this might be the long-term goals, right? And then the short-term goals or objectives would be, in our first example, log on to your computer, read your emails, respond to your emails, complete an internet search for 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, 60 minutes, right? So we could break them down as much or as little as we needed to, and we could take care of that with our short-term goals, aka objectives. Same thing with the other long-term goal. We could break down all of the different steps. We'll take their medication, brush their teeth, etc. Okay, so short-term goals, building blocks. Here's some different qualities of long-term goals versus short-term goals. Long-term goals are focused on occupation, so our big hunks, right? ADL, IADL, work, school, leisure. The final outcome of the therapeutic process. So in our examples, that's what we would want before discharge. They have a long-term target, they're global and broad, and they're multi-dimensional. So they would include a bunch of different objectives. Alternately, our short-term goals or objectives are a single specific behavior. They're shorter term, so again, this building block idea. They're unidimensional, which means that they're just covering one aspect of what we're working on, and they're derived from and related to a goal. So goal and objectives. That's my shorthand. So here's an example. Long-term goal. Client will be independent in utilizing a monthly calendar and payments log in order to pay monthly bills on time with no errors in 3 months per report from the client's parent. So our long-term goal has to do with an IADL of money management, right? So paying your bills. We want this to be error-free. That's important when you're paying your bills. And we're going to give 3 months for this long-term goal to be met. The short-term goals could be as follows. And there's a lot of different short-term goals that you could write for this long-term goal. So again, you're going to figure out what is it that is hard for this client and write those short-term goals to that information that was identified in the evaluation. Okay, so number 1, the client will analyze a bill statement and write a check for the correct amount of 3 or 4 attempts with minimal verbal cues within 2 weeks, as observed by the OT. So when we break it down, it's a smaller hunk, right? They're analyzing one bill, they're writing one check, they're doing it less of the total time, 75% of the time, or 3 of 4 attempts. And we're giving them some assist, minimal verbal cues. It's also got a shorter time frame, 2 weeks. The second one, the client will correctly record a list of monthly bills and the due dates in the calendar with supervision in 1 month as observed by the OT. So in this one, we're looking at a different aspect of bill paying. We're saying, okay, they're going to put everything on the calendar so that they can remember to pay the bills when the bills come due. And again, we have to what level they're doing it, how much help they're getting supervision, and the time frame, which is 1 month. So again, it's a shorter time period. It's actually probably going to take them a little longer to get to this step. So it's longer than the first short-term goal, but it's shorter than the long-term goal. When we think about school-based OT goals, either for an IEP or an ITP, and again, that's individualized educational plan or individualized transition plan, there's some things that we want to keep in mind. So the goals must support the academic and or vocational goals and objectives. The goals must be measurable and verifiable through assessment. So we need to be able to measure them and report back. The goals must be time sensitive and finite. They're usually reviewed and modified annually, but in most school districts, at least in this area, you check in about them quarterly. The goals will often have quarterly benchmarks. There you go. And the quarterly benchmarks are the short-term goals. So if I had read ahead one line, I could have told you that. All right. So annually for the long-term goals, quarterly for the short-term goals. That's the school-based way. And then progress reports for current levels of performance are written using benchmarks and the annual goal. The benchmarks are yet another word for saying short-term goals or objectives. It's just language of the schools. And so the goals, the short-term goals or benchmarks build up to the long-term goal. There's a guy named Mager who wrote a book called Instructional Objectives, and it's not so much for OTs as for educators, but it's a really great book. If you want to check it out, it's from 1997. It's very easy read. It's really cool. And what he says is, if you don't know where you are going, how do you know when you will get there? Meaning that if we don't have goals and objectives and a way of measuring progress in our clients, how are we going to know when we have achieved what we set out to do? Here are some resources for goal writing, and as I said in the presenter notes on your handout, they're not perfect, but they'll give some entry spaces. And one thing that I found was really helpful especially when I was newer and writing goals, is looking at samples of well-written goals, and then tailoring my clients' goals to kind of fit the format or the structure that already existed in some goals that I was using as models. So that may help you as well. We'll also, as I said, do a lot of goal writing in class and looking at goals and coming up with goals and figuring out how to best characterize what these occupational behaviors that we want to see develop, how we can best characterize them in the form of goals, both long-term and short-term. Congratulations, you've reached the end of the goal writing lecture. I hope it was helpful, and please direct any questions that you might have to me in class or via any of our other communication means. All right, have a great day, everyone. See you soon. Bye.